Hi there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is, and welcome. I'm Larry Erickson. This is the Erickson Report. And we start, as we have been doing, with some updates on the GOPR, that is Republican, that is fanatical right wing, attempts to undermine elections through voter suppression. As before, some of the news is good, some of it's bad. We do this because you need to be aware of at least some of the literally hundreds of court battles going on now regarding voting rights and procedures, almost every one of them pushed by the right wing in an effort to limit, hinder, block, or otherwise interfere with the ability of people to vote, especially people of certain groups, particularly the elderly, the young, and non-whites. In other words, the people that they think are most likely to vote for non-reactionaries. You also need to understand that this is part of an ongoing campaign by the right wing to constrain voting to its preferred groups. Now, this is not new. In fact, trying to control who gets to vote is as old as the country itself, but it has intensified recently. Since 2014, 40 states have passed laws making it harder for people to vote, and more than 17 million voters have been purged from, that is, kicked off, voter rolls. But this blizzard of court cases is new. And you have to figure it means that they know that in the long run that they are losing, and they're running out of time to screw things up in order to try to prevent that. So, starting with the bad news. On October 5th, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld a South Carolina rule that requires state voters who vote absentee to have a witness sign their ballot. Now, the rule itself is not new, but it was suspended during the primary because local judges found it an undue burden on people to get a witness to sign their ballot during the COVID-19 pandemic. But apparently figuring, hey, we've turned the corner on COVID, SCOTUS just decided that the tradition of the feds keeping out of state-level decisions about state election laws don't count. And so the witness requirement is now back in force. Capitalizing on that, just 2 days later, on October 7th, the South Carolina State Election Commission barred election officials in the state from what's called ballot curing. That is, it blocked those officials from giving voters who submitted a ballot without a signature a chance to correct that. The result could be that any ballot received after October 7th without a signature could be tossed, effectively invalidating unknown thousands of votes and voters, doubtless making Lindsey Graham Cracker very happy. That ruling by the Election Committee is under challenge in federal court, but either way, it is another case of election chaos being deliberately created by the right wing. On October 21st, there was a double punch. The Supreme Court allowed Alabama to ban curbside voting for voters with disabilities or who face a high risk of contracting COVID-19. And an Iowa court upheld a law that makes it harder to fix ballots with absentee voting. That is, it hinders ballot curing. And on October 26th, the Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court, blocked a lower court that allowed Wisconsin to accept mailed ballots received within 6 days of the election, provided they were postmarked by Election Day. Speaking of slow mail, as I expect you know, Postmaster General, only because he was a major Tweety Pie campaign donor, Louis DeJoy, made numerous changes to U.S. Postal Service operations in a transparent attempt to disrupt mail-in voting in order to screw things up, in order to affect timely mail delivery. Despite multiple federal courts having issued orders to block those changes, some USPS divisions still have not complied, with the result that election mail is still not being processed as fast as it was before those changes. Mail disruptions have been particularly pronounced in key swing states. Now, the postal system standard is that first-class mail is delivered in no more than 3 days. Before DeJoy started his Kill the Vote campaign, something like 92% or even a little more of first-class mail met that standard. But now, in 17 postal districts across 10 swing states, on-time first-class mail delivery is down to 84%, which means more than 15% of first-class mail does not meet that standard. One place that's notable is Detroit, Michigan, a city with a heavy minority population and a heavy history of voting for Democrats. On-time mail rate there has dropped from 92.2% in January to 71% in October. News reports also say that major cities in North Carolina have experienced 10% drop in on-time arrival rates. Well, according to a report from the U.S. Inspector General, timeliness, this is quoting, timeliness also varied widely in postal districts in Pennsylvania and Florida. On top of all that, Tweety Pie's calls for voter intimidation appear to be bearing fruit. For one example, in St. Augustine, Florida, 2 armed men dressed as security guards set up a tent near an early voting site and claimed that they had been hired by the Trump campaign, which, in fact, they hadn't been. News accounts say that at several sites across the country, including in California and New Mexico, Tweety Pie supporters have been gathering near polling sites, which reportedly, quote, worrying those waiting to vote, which clearly does mean that those people felt at least some degree of intimidation. And even if you're able to dodge the lies and misinformation, even if you get through the bureaucratic mazes thrown your way, even if you run the gauntlet of people with guns trying to scare you away from voting, the goppers will still look for ways to throw out your vote. One of the sleaziest of these is signature matching, which could result in thousands of perfectly legitimate ballots being thrown out. Signature matching involves the comparing of a signature on an absentee or mail-in ballot with the signature on when the voter originally registered to vote. It's used in 31 states as a fraud prevention measure, but in the hands of those wanting to suppress votes, it is an ideal tool to do just that, because the method of signature comparison has been described as election phrenology and witchcraft, and depends on the subjective judgment of people who are trained, not trained in the forensic principles and methods involved, and using procedures that, according to Kristen Clark, president of the Lawyers Committee for Equal Rights Under Law, procedures that would not stand up in a court of law. The result, according to an analysis by Dr. Alexander Street, associate professor of political science at Carroll College in Helen, Montana, and regarded as an expert in voting and ballot procedures, 97% of ballots that are rejected because of supposed signature mismatches are, in fact, valid. Writing in The Atlantic recently, journalist David Graham said that, quoting him, even in normal election cycles, signature matching requirements result in many ballots being rejected. Hundreds of thousands of such ballots were disqualified this way in 2016. More significantly, he said, rejections disproportionately hit certain demographic groups, including elderly voters, young voters, and voters of color. In other words, the usual suspects. For a specific example, exact match requirements in Georgia led to Latinx and Asians being disqualified 6 times more often than whites, 8 times more likely in the case of black voters. By the way, 2 other groups also adversely affected are immigrants and people with disabilities. Now, I think it's a quick sidebar here. You may be thinking, yeah, but they're going to disqualify a lot of GOPR votes that way too, which may be true, but they don't care. Remember that it's universally accepted that same-day voting will favor the right, while mail-in voting will favor Democrats. So the right wing would be happy to have all mail-in ballots discarded. And overall, they figured that any suppression of mail-in votes is going to hurt Democrats more than GOPRs. But we'll end this time by adding that even on this front, there is some good news. Pennsylvania's Supreme Court ruled on October 23rd that, quoting the court, county boards of elections are prohibited from rejecting absentee or mail-in ballots based on signature comparison conducted by county election officials or employees, or as the result of third-party challenges based on signature analysis and comparisons. In other words, don't do it. One other bit of good news. Early this month, Pennsylvania's Supreme Court allowed officials to count mail-in ballots received up to 3 days after Election Day, even if the postmark is illegible. Now, some state goppers filed an emergency appeal to the Supreme Court looking to block that decision, but on October 19th, SCOTUS refused to hear the appeal, which means that state decision stands. One sort of amusing side note to this is that as a part of the GOP's argument in their emergency appeal was to claim that the state court decision presents what they called an open invitation to voters to cast their ballots after November 3rd. Now, the thing is, for that to work, a voter would have to not vote until then, send in their ballot after November 3rd, which wouldn't be picked up until the 4th, which means it only has 2 days to get there, and it would have to have an illegible postmark, because otherwise it would be discarded as having been sent too late. I wonder if anyone thought to ask the Gopper lawyers how the voter would arrange for that part. Okay, this show will be on shortly before Election Day, so it's quite possible, even probable, that you are seeing this after November 3rd. If that's so, we may or may not have some good idea about the outcome by that time. We probably won't. The Columbia Journalism Review notes that while in previous elections, in most places about 3 to 5% of votes are absentee or mail-in, in this one it could top 30%. So it will take a while. One thing to watch is Florida. See, Florida counts absentee and mail-in ballots as they arrive. So it's possible that by late on November 3rd, media outlets will be able to call the state for either Tweety Pie or Blodden. If it goes for Tweety Pie, there's a big and probably drawn-out fight in store. But if it goes for Blodden, Tweety Pie is very likely toast. All right, expect, too, that same-day results are, again, expected to be more favorable for Tweety Pie, and there are predictions that the Goppers will use those early votes to claim victory and then use that bogus claim to screech fraud when the counting of mail-in votes flips those early results, which I expect you have heard, but I wanted to remind you to be ready for it and to be ready for the necessity of being as loud as they are. Even if the best of what is now available to us happens, even if the White House and the Senate both flip, all of my talking about voter suppression, which is intended to give you a sense of the status and the scope of the right-wing campaign in that direction, in the direction of voter suppression, it will all still matter because those efforts will not stop. One thing the left can still learn from the right is sheer sitzfleisch, sheer stubbornness. Because as far as the right wing is concerned, even issues you think are settled are up for debate as long as the right wing hasn't won. Which brings me to my next topic, which we will take up after the break. And we are back. Something we thought that, or at least should have been able to think, was over and done with may again be in the line of fire: same-sex marriage. The right-wing bigots have never gotten over the fact that they're on the wrong side of history and still dream of undoing the historic gain of Obergefell v. Hodges, the landmark 2015 case that found marriage equality to be a constitutional right. Which is why Justices Clarabelle Thomas and Sam the Sham Alito grabbed an opportunity to pretty much call for Obergefell to be overturned and invite challenges to it. The occasion was the Supreme Court refusing to hear an appeal in the case of Kim Davis, a former county clerk in Kentucky who got national attention for refusing to issue marriage licenses to same-sex couples, claiming it was against her religion. The Twisted Two agreed with the decision to decline the appeal, but took time to call out Davis as one of the first victims of what they called the court's cavalier treatment of religion in the Obergefell decision, but claimed she will not be the last, and dramatically called the case a stark reminder of the consequences of Obergefell. They wrote that Obergefell, quoting, enables courts and governments to brand religious adherents who believe that marriage is between one man and one woman as bigots, making their religious liberty concerns that much easier to dismiss. Okay, first off, those people are bigots. And I recall an old saying that calling things by their right names is the beginning of wisdom. And here's something else for you. 30 years ago, in a case, Employment Division v. Smith, the Supreme Court ruled that the First Amendment's protection of free exercise of religion does not allow a person to use a religious motivation as a reason not to obey generally applicable laws, such as, I would say, laws against discrimination. Quoting Antonin Skeletor, who wrote the decision, to permit this would be to make the professed doctrines of religious belief superior to the laws of the land, and in effect to permit every citizen to become a law unto himself. But the thing is, that case involved the use of hallucinogenic peyote in Native American religious ceremonies. Reactionaries don't give a damn about Native American religion. Obergefell, on the other hand, was about something the right wing does care about: their religious freedom to be bigots even in their official duties and commercial enterprises. And besides, as has long been established, intellectual or ethical consistency means nothing to them. Which is illustrated by the fact that the Twisted Two declared that by recognizing the right to marriage equality, quoting, the court has created a problem that only it can fix. Until then, Obergefell will continue to have ruinous consequences for religious liberty. Which Steve Vladeck, a CNN legal analyst and University of Texas Law School professor, accurately called a telling and ominous message. According to Tim Holbrook, a professor at Emory University School of Law, Clarabelle and Sam DeSham have sent a signal to state legislatures, quoting him, a signal to state legislatures to challenge Obergefell on religious liberty grounds. In an op-ed at CNN, Holbrook warned such efforts could be successful. That doesn't mean, he said, that marriage equality would be directly overturned, because no, the right wing is too clever for that. Instead, look for reactionary courts to keep carving out religious exceptions, religious exemptions to marriage equality, plus chipping away at attendant rights like adoption and allowing same-sex parents to be listed as parents on birth certificates. In other words, doing to marriage equality the same thing they've been doing to abortion rights, leaving the form intact while removing the substance. Worse, this comes at a time when Amy Bugs Bunny Barrett, who served for nearly 3 years on the board of the private Christian Trinity schools run by a church of which she is part and which openly discriminated against LGBTQ people, even to the point of refusing to allow the children of same-sex parents to attend. It comes at a time when she has created a 6-3 reactionary majority on the Supreme Court. It also comes at a time when a peer-reviewed study released a month ago showed that LGBTQ folks are nearly 4 times as likely to be the victims of a violent crime than their heterosexual cisgender counterparts. The study by the Williams Institute at the University of California, Los Angeles School of Law was based on data from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, figures that weren't released until 2019 and weren't even gathered until after 2016. Now, there is one bit of light in all this darkness. Pope Francis has restated his support for same-sex civil unions. Quoting the Pope, homosexual people have the right to be in a family. They are children of God. What we have to have is a civil union law. That way they are legally protected. What's important here is that this is the first time he said this as Pope. The difference between saying it as a bishop, which he had done, and saying it as Pope, a role which requires him to be much more careful in his language, is significant. Which also, by the way, is why I forgive him for saying civil union and not marriage. The Catholic Church regards marriage as a sacrament, and calling for the sort of doctrinal change that Catholic marriage would entail was really too much to expect him, too far to expect him to go. Now, we can entertain the notion that this will cause some right-wingers, or at least Catholic right-wingers, to rethink their persistent denial of the reality of same-sex marriage, since marriage in the U.S. as a matter of law is a civil matter, not a religious ceremony. but I wouldn't hold out much hope. Anyway, a footnote to all this relating to the typical cowardice of the bigots when called out on their bigotry. When AP asked Trinity Schools about its anti-LGBTQ policies, the answer was, and I'm quoting, "Trinity Schools does not unlawfully discriminate with respect to race, color, gender, national origin, age, disability, or other legally protected classification under applicable law with respect to the administration of its programs." Except that's not what they were asked. Their answer is like saying that you were accused of robbing a store in Detroit, and you answered by denying that you would ever robbed any store in the state of Wisconsin. Okay, and now we get to our regular feature, 2 weeks of stupid clowns and outrages. Madison Cawthorn and Mo Davis are in a tight race in North Carolina's 11th Congressional District. You'll know which one is the gopper, which one the clown, when I tell you that Cawthorn attacked Tom Fiedler, one of Davis's supporters, by saying Fiedler went, quote, to work for non-white males like Cory Booker, who aims to ruin white males running for office. And when he was called out at his racism, blamed poor syntax. Know them by their fruits. Racist clowns. Speaking of racist clowns, we come to Jared Kushner, who described Black America's issues with inequality and racism in the country as complaining, and suggested that the reason for their disproportionate lack of wealth, lack of job opportunities, the health disparities, the other inequalities, that's all because black people really don't want to be successful. On, naturally, Fox and Friends on October 26th, he blathered that Tweety Pie's policies can help the black community, quote, break out of the problems that they're complaining about, but he can't want them to be successful more than they want to be successful. I predict he'd be a repeat clown, but I have some hope we'll never hear from him again. We have enough clowns to go around. But finally, for this time out, we have the return of a former champion, Pat Robertson, and I could actually stop there, but there is more. He said on his show, The 700 Club, last week, that everyone should be sure to vote because God had told him that Tweety Pie is going to win, and, quoting him, it's going to lead to civil unrest and then a war against Israel and so forth, as predicted in Ezekiel 38. In other words, get out and vote for Tweety Pie because that will help bring about the end times, when Jesus comes back to earth for the final judgment and the end of the world. Which actually sounds to me like a good reason for copper voters to stay home. Although admittedly, he's certainly not the only one to think a second term for Tweety Pie would be the end of the world. By the way, this is at least the third time he has predicted the apocalypse. In 1976, he predicted it would occur in 1982. In 1990, he said it would come in 2017. Now it's Tweety Pie's second term that will initiate events. Pat Robertson, a clown, but at least a consistent one. All right, for our outrages, we have two this time, the first of which involves a repeat offender, our major news media. Okay, on October 19th, a U.S. Postal Service carrier named Crystal Nicole Myrie was charged with embezzling mail she was supposed to deliver. When questioned on October 16th, she admitted to stealing several prepaid debit cards and using them at retail stores. She also admitted that she had been stealing mail sporadically for almost 2 years. She was taken to her car, where investigators found several Postal Service satchels containing nearly 200 pieces of mail, one of which, it turned out, was a mail-in ballot. Okay, she's been stealing mail for nearly 2 years. She's been stealing prepaid debit cards. She was found with 200 pieces of mail, including one mail-in ballot. Guess which part of that was the lead? Actually, don't guess. You already know. This is how AP opened its story, quoting, a U.S. Postal Service carrier is accused of stealing a Miami-Dade County mail-in ballot, 10 gift cards, and 4 prepaid debit cards earlier this month, federal authorities said. The headline was, Postal Carrier Accused of Stealing Mail-in Ballot in Miami. This is disgraceful. At a time when the right wing is doing its damnedest to undermine mail-in voting, at a time when they evoke fraud like they used to invoke Benghazi, to at such a time deliberately emphasize that one item, one which clearly was there by coincidence, one having nothing to do with any intention on Myra's part regarding the election, it's journalistic malpractice. It is offensive. It is an outrage. And our other thing relates to the election, but in a different way, and it's a bit esoteric, but it did strike me as notable. Texas is one of the states that uses signature matching for ballot security. Now, it actually uses a somewhat better method than many. Apparently, there are two panels, one of local election officials and one independent panel, that make the comparison. If either one of them, by simple majority vote, accepts the ballot, then it's accepted, even if the other panel disagrees. But the system has one major flaw. Voters must be notified that their ballots were rejected within 10 days after the election is over, which makes it impossible for voters to have any opportunity to correct what is, after all, a technical error. In September, U.S. District Judge in West District of Texas required election officials to notify voters whose ballots were rejected due to a signature mismatch, and if they couldn't set up a system to do that, then they could not reject ballots on that basis. On October 19th, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals overturned that ruling in a decision thoroughly immersed in right-wing mythology about mail-in ballot fraud, going on and on about Texas preserving the integrity of its elections while ignoring the unknown thousands of perfectly legitimate ballots that are going to be disenfranchised by the state's use of an astonishingly error-prone method, remember 97% of doing so. Okay, so why is this decision here rather than my discussion about voter suppression? Because a main part of the court's argument for tossing the earlier ruling is the finding that plaintiffs in this case don't have what's called a 14th Amendment liberty interest in the right to vote by mail. A liberty interest is defined as a right conferred on an individual by the due process clauses of either the federal or state constitution. And they said the plaintiffs didn't have one. In fact, the decision spent several pages upbraiding lower courts for ever having endorsed the idea that voting is protected by the Constitution's guarantee of due process. And here's the outrage. If this decision accurately reports the facts, no federal court has ever determined that you actually have a constitutional right to vote at all. Lots of decisions about regulating voters, lots of provisions in the U.S. Constitution about how you can't be discriminated in voting if there is voting, but nothing that says that voting itself is a fundamental right. So if your state constitution does not have such a provision, you, or more accurately we as a people, have no constitutional right to vote. They may not have a lot of practical impact, for now anyway, but I find it outrageous, even if all it does is point at the fragility of our rights and freedoms and how they're based on assumptions of things just working out and everybody accepting that. We are now, or at least should now, in the face of organized voting chaos and the possibility of violent response to an election loss, be recognizing that we can't take even what's the most basic, most obvious part of being a self-governing people for granted. That is an outrage. And we are done for this time. You have the best 2 weeks you possibly can. We will see you in 2 weeks to talk about the election, I expect. But for now, as always, peace.